The mystery that touches the heart. Early morning, the autumn forest was still half asleep under a thick blanket of mist. With icy dew clinging to every withered golden leaf, the air was hazy, blurred, like an old painting that time had slowly faded. The soft crunch of dry leaves beneath a man's boots echoed faintly, blending with the cold breath of dawn in the wilderness. Hunter James moved with the patience of someone well-versed in this game of survival. In his hands, the heavy hunting rifle felt as familiar as an extension of his own body. Every step was deliberate, every breath restrained, so as not to disturb the stillness of the forest. He had always believed he understood this place better than anyone. The rhythm of the grass and trees, the cautious footsteps of timid deer, the distant alarm calls of birds hidden high above. But that morning, things did not go as they usually did. From a distance, a faint movement flickered through the mist. Catching James's sharp gaze, he froze, lifted his rifle, eyes narrowing like a hawk's. Out of the thick white haze emerged a deer. Its frame was tall and slender, antlers rising like branches beaded with dew, glowing faintly gold in the newborn sunlight. But what made James frown was not its beauty. It was the way it moved, not the frantic dash of prey accustomed to fleeing, nor the tense caution of a creature sensing danger. Each step was slow, heavy, as though he was burdened by something far weightier than fear itself. James drew in a long breath, listening to the pounding of his own heartbeat. In 10 years of hunting, never had he seen a deer approach rather than run. His finger loosened on the trigger, uncertainty creeping in the animal's eyes, those deep, black pools reflecting both the mist and the morning sun. There was something that made him pause. It was not only fear, there was another emotion, faint but undeniable. A silent plea for help. Time seemed to hold its breath. The mist swirled between the two unlikely figures, predator and prey, now separated by only a few paces. The deer exhaled clouds of thin white vapor that trembled in the frigid air, dissolving into the breeze like words never spoken. Light pierced through the leaves above, illuminating patches of dried blood on its dark brown fur, painting a scene that was both hauntingly beautiful and profoundly sorrowful. James stood still, his fingers slipping away from the trigger, suddenly feeling like an intruder in a story that had nothing to do with this morning's hunt. A strange sensation swelled in his chest, not excitement, not the thrill of an impending kill, but unease laced with compassion. And in that fragile silence, it was as if the forest whispered, "Sometimes, nature holds more than survival. It carries silent cries for mercy." Today, James will witness something no one has ever spoken of before. And so, beneath the faint light of dawn, wrapped in a veil of mist, a fateful encounter began, not between hunter and prey, but between two lost souls, finding one another at the fragile boundary between life and empathy. A suspicion of something unusual. James stood in silence for a long while, the rifle in his hands slowly lowering, his heart filled with a strange sensation he had never experienced in the forest before. He was a hunter. His instincts should have been automatic: raise the gun, aim, pull the trigger, bring home the trophy. Yet in this moment, all he could do was stare into those eyes and feel an indescribable lump tightening in his throat. The deer kept moving toward him, step by slow, trembling step. When it was only a few yards away, the dim morning light revealed the truth, making James clench his fists. On its right shoulder was a large, ugly wound, fur matted together, darkened with dried blood and smeared with dirt. Every movement seemed like agony, yet strangely, it did not flee from him. Instead, its cautious approach felt almost trusting, as if it somehow knew this man would not hurt it. James swallowed hard, finally lowering his rifle completely and slinging it behind his back. He slowly extended one hand forward, palm open, his voice low and rough from the morning chill. "Easy there, it's all right, buddy." He had never done this before. To him, wild animals had always been targets, not creatures to be soothed. But now, the instinct of the hunter no longer ruled him. Only a man stood there, facing a living being that was pleading for help. The deer halted, its thin legs trembling, threatening to buckle beneath it. Its dark eyes met James's gaze, and in them, there was no longer a gap carved by fear, but a fragile, desperate hope. Its breaths came shallow and uneven, each one rattling painfully in its chest. In the absolute stillness of the forest, James could hear his own heartbeat drumming in his ears, urging him to act. A thought struck him suddenly, unfamiliar and unsettling. If I walk away now, it will die. Slowly and alone. This was not the rush of triumph from a successful hunt, nor the detached calm of someone accustomed to blood and carcasses. This was the weight of knowing he had a choice, to save or to kill. And for the first time, James felt his hands tremble at the thought of letting that life slip into darkness. He crouched down, lowering himself to avoid scaring the animal. This time, his hand reached out even closer, just a breath away from its nose. The deer tilted its head slightly, ears drooping low. It did not run. Instead, a weak, rasping sound escaped its throat, a broken whimper that felt like pain held back for far too long. James felt a pressure building in his chest, as though the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting for his decision. Never in all his years had he imagined that the creatures he hunted could beg, could seek help from the one they should have feared. Everything he thought he knew seemed to crumble, leaving only a man standing in the woods, staring into eyes full of despair, guided by nothing but conscience. A cold breeze swept past, carrying the damp scent of fallen leaves and the metallic tang of dried blood. James clenched his fist, whispering almost to himself, "All right, I will not hurt you." The deer closed its eyes for a fleeting moment, as if it understood, then opened them again to meet his. The line separating hunter and prey felt as thin as a spider's thread. And along that fragile thread, something began to grow. Trust. Shaky, delicate, yet strong enough to make the entire forest fall into an uncanny silence. In that silence, James understood this was not a random encounter. This was a sign, a turning point he had never been prepared for. He knew that once he chose to step toward this wounded creature, everything he believed about instinct, about survival in the deep woods, would never be the same. And so, beneath the cold veil of an autumn morning, Hunter James, a seasoned hunter, felt, for the first time in his life, his hands ready to save rather than to kill. The hidden truth and the journey begins. James quietly lowered himself beside the trembling creature, moving his hand with painstaking slowness, as though any sudden motion could shatter the fragile trust that had just begun to form between them. The deer stepped back slightly, its instinct for caution still intact, but it did not run. Its eyes met his, and in those dark, glistening depths, James saw a pain that went far beyond the physical, a heavy, suffocating despair that clung to every breath it took. As the pale light filtered through the thick morning mist, James finally understood why the deer was moving with such difficulty. Its hind leg was still caught in a jagged metal trap, the rusty jaws biting deep into its flesh. Blood and dirt clung to the wound, the surrounding tissue swollen and raw. It had likely been dragging itself through the forest for days, each step sheer torment, clinging desperately to a fading hope of survival. And now, by some strange twist of fate, it had found him, a man who, to this forest, had always been the embodiment of death. James clenched his jaw. Over the years, he had come across these cruel traps before, set by faceless poachers who hunted not for food or survival but to assert power over nature. He had ignored them, chalked it up as part of the game, but now that game lay before him in its most brutal, undeniable form. He whispered softly, "My God, how long have you been suffering?" James knew what needed to be done, but he also knew the risk. He could try to remove the trap, but a wild animal in pain and panic could be dangerous. One sudden lunge from those antlers could pierce straight through him. And worse, the smell of blood, the vulnerability of this deer, could easily draw wolves or other predators nearby. Yet the thought of walking away, of leaving this creature to writhe and die alone, was something James could no longer bear. A memory of his late father surfaced, sharp and vivid. He saw himself as a boy, too small to lift a rifle, following his father through the wilderness. The man had placed a strong, calloused hand on his son's shoulder and said, "Remember this, son. A true hunter knows when to pull the trigger and when to lower his weapon and listen to the forest." James closed his eyes for a brief moment, hearing his father's voice echo through time. When he opened them again, his choice was already etched into his heart. He would save this deer, no matter the cost. He slipped off his backpack and rummaged through it, pulling out a length of rope, his hunting knife, and a few old cloth rags usually meant for cleaning his rifle. This would take patience, absolute patience, and a little luck. He inhaled deeply, taking a half-step closer, his voice low and steady. "I'm going to help you, but you need to trust me." The deer panted weakly, its tear-bright eyes fixed on his every movement. It still trembled, but it did not flee. Perhaps its will to live outweighed its fear, or perhaps an invisible thread of trust had already begun to form between them. James slowly moved toward the injured leg. Each time his fingers neared the trap, the deer flinched violently, pain ripping through its body, breath rasping like wind trapped in a broken flute. He had to stop again and again, murmuring softly, offering calm in exchange for just a few precious seconds to think of a way to free it from the metal jaws. The forest fell into an eerie, taut silence, as if the world itself were holding its breath. No bird song, no rustling leaves, only two rapid heartbeats pounding in sync, one driven by pain, the other by fear and determination. After long, tense minutes wrestling with his own hesitation, James made a decision. He would not risk removing the trap here. It was too deep, too dangerous to handle on this rough ground. He needed a safer place, near water, where they could rest and he could work carefully to free the animal. He stripped off his outer jacket, twisting it into a makeshift lead, looping it gently around the deer's neck, not to restrain, but to guide. At first, the deer recoiled, fear flaring in its eyes. James stayed still, patient, refusing to pull, letting it decide. After a long moment, the animal lowered its head, breathed in his earthy, human scent, and finally took a hesitant step forward. James let out a quiet sigh of relief, and together, they began their journey. The forest path was rough, treacherous with roots and thorny undergrowth. Branches lashed at James's clothes. The wilderness hummed around them, and from time to time, the wind carried distant wolf howls that made the hair on his neck bristle. He knew predators could smell blood from far away, and time was not on their side. He walked briskly, yet never faster than the deer could manage. Sometimes, the wounded animal would stumble, collapsing with ragged breaths, pain too fierce for its trembling legs to bear. Each time, James crouched beside it, laying a reassuring hand on its neck, murmuring soft, meaningless words, just enough to tell it that it was no longer alone. Step by step, the fragile bond between hunter and prey grew stronger, carrying them deeper into the forest, toward a slim chance of survival, one James was determined to fight for, no matter the danger ahead. Rescue and a bond beyond species. The setting sun cast a soft orange-red glow over the forest. Fading into the mist that was slowly lifting, James and the deer had been moving for hours, crossing small streams, pushing through thorny thickets, climbing slippery slopes. Their breaths came heavy and ragged, mingling in the cold evening air. The deer was weakening with every step, its legs trembling as if they might give out at any moment. James scanned the area until his eyes landed on a spot by a small creek. The water there trickled clear and calm, and flat stones jutted out like nature's own workbenches. This would have to be the place where he would try to free the deer from the cruel jaws of the trap that had been torturing it. He dropped his backpack to the ground, his hands icy not just from the night chill, but from the tension that had been building since the moment he first saw the creature. He knew what was about to happen next would draw the line between life and death for the deer, and possibly for himself. James moved closer and knelt beside the injured leg. The deer jolted violently, its body seized by pain and primal panic. It panted hard, its sides heaving, eyes wide and frantic. James spoke low and steady, his voice carrying all the calm he could muster, willing it to pass into the terrified animal. "Easy now, I am going to get you out of this damn thing." He drew his hunting knife from his belt, the cold blade flashing faintly in the dim light. The metallic glint only made the deer more tense, its body stiff, legs twitching uncontrollably. James took a slow breath, laid a firm hand on its neck, feeling the wild drum of its heartbeat under the warm fur. He needed it to understand he meant no harm. After a few endless seconds, the deer began to settle, its breath still rapid but less frantic than before. James got to work. He slid the knife toward the rusted metal clamp biting into raw flesh. The smell of blood, earth, and sweat thickened in the cold air. Each time he tried to pry it open, the deer convulsed, its body shaking violently, pitiful groans tearing through the quiet forest. Fresh blood welled up, bright and stark against the ground. James felt his hands trembling, not only from the effort but from the crushing weight of guilt pressing on his chest. The guilt of a lifetime spent hunting, now condensed into this single moment where he tried desperately to save a life he once would have claimed without thought. He murmured under his breath, avowed to himself and to the spirit of the forest. No more hunting games, not today. The first attempt failed, the trap barely budged, and the deer's strangled cry nearly broke his resolve. But he could not stop. He thought of the look in its eyes that morning, stepping out of the mist, handing him what felt like one last chance to make something right. He tried again, patient and precise, working the knife under the cold iron, prying bit by bit. Time seemed to stretch endlessly thin. In the distance, low howls of wolves rose and carried closer. They were following the scent of blood. James heard it clearly, but his hands did not falter. One wrong move could make the wound worse. But if he did not hurry, both of them would be prey before night fully fell. Sweat beaded on his forehead, running down his face despite the icy air. His heartbeat thundered in his ears, hands shaking with tension. Then finally, with one last firm, desperate pull, the trap snapped open and clattered onto the stones with a harsh metallic clang. The deer collapsed instantly, breath shallow and uneven, blood spilling freely. James flung the trap far from them, then tore his shirt into strips with trembling hands. He pressed down hard on the wound, wrapping it tight, his movements brisk but filled with a gentleness rarely found in the hands of a hunter. He prayed under his breath, begging for the bleeding to stop before it was too late. When he was done, James sat back heavily, his hands coated in crimson. Not his own blood, yet it weighed on him as though it was. The deer lay still, eyes half closed, its breathing faint but steadier than before. Silence blanketed the forest, broken only by the murmur of the creek and the pounding of James's heart. Then something extraordinary happened. The deer slowly lifted its head, with effort and trembling, and turned toward James. It took one small, halting step forward and lowered its head, pressing its warm forehead gently against his blood-stained hand. There were no words, just that simple, powerful gesture, a thank you that needed no language, a gratitude that crossed every boundary between species. James froze, letting the warmth seep from that touch all the way to his soul. For the first time in years, he felt he was no longer an intruder in this forest, no longer a bringer of death to its living beings, but part of life itself, fragile yet undeniably real. Night fell around them, stars blinking faintly overhead. The deer remained beside him, quiet and unafraid, like a companion who had survived a battle at his side. And under the pale light of the moon, the two creatures, once hunter and hunted, looked at each other in silence, bound now by trust and compassion, something no bullet or bloodshed had ever been able to create. The change born from a single encounter. The dawn of a new day broke gently, a thin mist floating above the forest that had endured all along. Cold night, the first rays of light touched branches still heavy with dew, scattering 1,000 tiny reflections like crystals suspended in the air. The creek's soft murmur played in the silence, a soothing song of nature washing away the pain of the night before. James stirred awake, his shoulders aching from sleeping slumped beside the deer all night. He glanced over to see it curled up near the small fire he had built to keep them both warm. The strips of his torn shirt, tied around its wounded leg, were stained dark with dried blood, but no fresh bleeding seeped through. Its breathing was steady now, fragile yet resilient, a life barely pulled back from death's grasp. He sat there for a long time, quietly watching the rise and fall of its chest. Something inside him was shifting, silent yet profound, a change that carried no fanfare but felt irreversible. For years, James had lived between two worlds, the world of guns, traps, and the thrill of the hunt, and the world of endless forest silence. He had always believed he belonged to the first, that only there could he grasp some semblance of control in his wandering, broken life. But this morning, as he looked at the delicate creature still breathing beside him, he realized those years had been nothing more than running. He had not been in control of anything. He had simply been fleeing from the truth that he had once stolen countless lives for no reason but his own hollow escape. The deer stirred, it pushed itself up, legs trembling yet stronger than the day before. James hurried forward, fearing it might collapse, but the animal shook its head softly, as if to say it was all right. It took a few tentative steps around the clearing before turning its gaze on him. Those eyes, still tired, but clear and deep as that misty morning when their paths first crossed. James swallowed hard, a knot tightening in his throat. He knew this moment had to come. He could not keep it here, could not turn it into part of his life like a pet. It belonged to the forest, to freedom, to the winds in far-off meadows he could never follow. He stepped closer, kneeling in front of it, his hand resting one last time on its neck. "Go," he whispered, his voice low and cracked like a secret he wished he could keep. "Go back to where you belong." The deer stood still for a few moments, listening. Then it lowered its head, pressing gently against his shoulder. A final gesture of trust and gratitude. Sacred silence filled the space between them, the quiet of two worlds that had met, only to part again. It turned away, stepping slowly across the damp leaves. James watched, his eyes fixed, etching every movement deep into his memory. When the distance grew far enough, the deer stopped, looked back at him one last time, fell along, unbroken gaze, and then disappeared into the silver mist, melting back into the vast forest as though the encounter had never happened except within his heart, where the story would live forever. James stood there for a long while, his hands tingling with the phantom warmth of the animal's touch. A breeze swept through, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth, a farewell whispered by the forest itself. In that moment, something strange yet certain filled him. He was no longer a hunter. He no longer found himself in the sound of metal sliding into place, nor in the crack of a rifle shot. His heart now beat in rhythm with birdsong, with rustling leaves, with the fragile breaths of wild, untamed life. Days later, James returned to his small cabin at the forest's edge. He took his rifle down from its rack, holding it for a long time, not with pride as he once had, but with a quiet sorrow, as though looking at a relic of a man who no longer existed. He hung it on the wall again, wiped away the dust, and swore to himself it would never again be raised to take a life for the sake of a hollow game. From that day on, James's path changed. He became a volunteer forest warden, no longer a tracker of prey, but a protector. He posted warning signs where illegal traps were set, dismantled every snare he came across, patrolled the woods to ensure no creature would endure the same suffering the deer had that night. Yet deep inside, James knew it had all begun with a single moment, a fragile being stepping out of the morning mist, eyes carrying something greater than fear. That fleeting encounter had reshaped everything he thought he knew about life, about compassion, about the fragile line between hunter and hunted. And James also knew that somewhere out there, in far-off stretches of forest, that deer still roamed, free and proud beneath the sunlight, carrying a piece of his heart along with it. A bond beyond species. Late afternoon, the last light of day stretched across distant hills, painting the forest in a warm shade of golden amber. A gentle autumn breeze swept through, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and damp earth from last night's rain. In the midst of this vast stillness, James stood silently on a rocky ledge overlooking a valley where a herd of deer grazed peacefully under the glow of the setting sun. The sight made his heart still. These delicate creatures, every cautious step, every lift of their heads as they listened to the wind, radiated a pure beauty he had never truly seen during his years of hunting. He realized that within every rustle of leaves, within every glance from their dark, gentle eyes, there existed something no bullet could ever reach. Life itself, the yearning to exist, to be free, and to be loved. A voice seemed to rise, deep and warm, like a truth spoken from the depths of human memory. We humans often believe that there is an unbreakable divide between ourselves and the animals. Separated by instinct, by fear, we walk into the forest as conquerors, convinced that our strength gives us the right to decide the fate of other living beings. But sometimes, all it takes is a single moment, a desperate gaze through the mist, for all those definitions to fall apart. James closed his eyes as the memory returned, clear and vivid. That foggy morning, the deer had stepped out of the cold haze, its breath misting in the frigid air. There had been no pleading in its eyes, no anger, only one unspoken truth, the silent call of a life that simply wanted to go on. In that instant, every hunting instinct within him dissolved, leaving only a man standing before a wounded soul in need of help. When humanity pauses long enough to hear the call of nature, we begin to understand that the line between predator and prey is not a wall set in stone. It is a bridge, and sometimes, once you have crossed that bridge, you will never want to return. Down in the valley, a young deer lifted its head, gazing toward James. The distance was too great for it to truly see him, but in those eyes, James thought he caught a reflection of the deer that had once vanished into the morning mist. The same depth, the same freedom, only this time unburdened by fear. A faint smile curved on James's lips, a smile he had lost long ago to gunfire and the hollow thrill of the hunt. He knew then that the choice he had made that day had not only saved a life but had also pulled his own soul back from the abyss of numbness. The voice returned once more, soft as a breath weaving into the forest breeze. There are stories that do not need to be written on paper, nor told aloud. They live in the eyes of a creature set free, in the heart of someone who once raised a weapon but chose to lower it. They remind us of a simple truth. Somewhere out there, in the quiet of the deep woods, every living being, no matter its shape, shares the same humble wish to live and to be loved. In the final scene, James turned away from the rocky ledge, walking down the narrowed trail leading toward his wooden cabin. In the distance, the herd of deer leapt lightly through the trees, their antlers catching the last rays of sunlight like flickering flames of freedom. The music swelled, deep, warm, and full of hope, closing the story not with an ending, but with a promise that between humans and nature, there is always a chance to heal, to reconnect, and to belong once more.